Welcome to the Brainbox podcast. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that brings humanities scholarship to the general public. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. Brainbox is a podcast for your noggin. It's meant to challenge our guests to make the humanities relevant to current issues and challenge listeners to use their Brainbox to make better sense of the human experience. We talk to experts in humanities fields like history, philosophy, literature, and ethics who give informed views and deeper context to current issues. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard, and you can also find all of our previous episodes by going to our website, okhumanities.org/brainbox. And we're also on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting libraries. You can email comments and questions to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Underwriting support for this episode of Brainbox is provided by The Springer Company, an Oklahoma company specializing in payroll and bookkeeping for small employers, nonprofits, and local government agencies. For more information, visit thespringercompany.com. In this episode, we're going to talk about where the world of sports meets the wide world of the humanities. Specifically, we're going to look at the history of college sports and how they affect American society and culture with our guest, Dr. Amy Carreiro. Dr. Carreiro's research interests and publications include United States cultural history with an emphasis on the African American experience. She's taught courses on the history of American sport, sport and film, and the globalization of American sports. Dr. Carreiro served as the Oklahoma Humanities State Scholar for the Smithsonian's Museum on Main Street traveling exhibition about sports called Hometown Teams from 2013 to 2016. Dr. Carreiro received her PhD in history from Oklahoma State University in 1997. She taught at the University of Tulsa from 1998 to 2008 and at OSU from 2008 to 2018. She's presently semi-retired and living in her home state of Rhode Island. Her article, Equal Access to Hometown Teams, Hurdling Race and Gender Barriers in Oklahoma Sports, appeared in the winter 2015 edition of Oklahoma Humanities Magazine, and we're going to put a link to that article on the webpage for this episode. So welcome, Amy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
I really wish I'd taken a history of sports class in college. It sounds awesome, and I'm going to try not to ask you to just distill the whole class down to this one podcast episode. But I want to start by asking about kind of the historical and cultural factors that led to the development of college sports. Like, when and why did colleges start to sponsor and fund sports programs?
Right. No, that's a good question because I think we assume that they always existed.
Yeah.
And if you go back into the 1800s, the early 1800s, college sports were more intramural. And it wasn't until we get close to the Civil War that schools start to compete against each other. And it's really in rowing with Harvard and Yale.
Oh.
And there's actually this great event where a railroad company sponsors one of this event up in New Hampshire. So think about people coming from New Haven, Connecticut, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, to go to an event in New Hampshire to watch their two schools compete, and they gave away free tickets to the family and fans. And that's pre-Civil War. So you can see that people recognize that sports were not only going to be fun and something to bring bonding, but potentially it could also make money.
Oh, okay. So college sports making money from the very beginning.
Well, other people making money on them. And it's right after the war where interest really starts to pick up. Schools start to build stadiums. Harvard builds a stadium that can hold 40,000 people. I mean, that's like a Texas high school football stadium today, right?
Yeah.
But you get to see that there is a sense that you can make money at the gate, especially in football, and you can sponsor all of your programs, which happens today for a lot of schools.
So we're talking like 1860s, 1870s, 1880s?
1870s, 1880s. Urbanization really helped. A lot of, people can travel between cities because of the railroad. Hubs like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, that all helps. Immigration, all of those things as the United States changes, people become more interested in entertainment. They have a little bit more spending money, too.
Oh, okay. Huh. So we're talking about money here at the very beginning. What are the roots of the concept of amateurism, and how has that concept changed over time, and how has it affected college sports?
I think for most of the schools who started in college sports, it's the Ivy Leagues. I like to say Harvard They kind of gave birth to football, and then Yale perfected it. And so when you think of schools like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, the Ivy Leagues playing, they dominated until World War II. We kind of think that's funny, but it's true. And so people going to those schools would never think of using sports as professionally. I mean, they had other things they were going to do. So when the state schools start to advocate, they realize they have to get people to come to their programs. They have to offer scholarships. And the NCAA, once they start to develop in the early years, they grow out of 1905. But by 1922, they realize that amateurism is important because it's so easy for people to recruit. I mean, just like we know today, they're trying to attract people, and you can throw money at them, and that's not going to be a fair advantage for some other schools that can't afford it.
There's definitely a push and pull between amateurism and professionalism going way back to the roots of college sports, I think. What are some key examples of how amateurism and professionalism have kind of been in conflict with each other in regard to college sports?
Well, I mean, I think that in baseball is one example that even today we don't see a lot of college baseball players end up in Major League Baseball. A lot of them are drafted early. So the NCAA has put restrictions over the years about keeping people in school. And so that's kind of one way, is that are you a student athlete or are you a professional? And so in baseball, that was a great way for middle class and working class men to earn money doing something that was fun and that they loved. And when we look at college baseball as it developed, it doesn't have the same following, say, as college football. So that's like one way of looking at maybe popularity of sports and the relationship to maybe professionalism.
So when did college sports really take off and become so wildly successful in the United States? How quickly did that develop?
It develops pretty quickly after the Civil War. And one of the things that happens is you think about how many people actually going to college. It's still very small, but they're still rooting. And as you're getting into the 20s, you have celebrity athletes. So if you think of Babe Ruth as a celebrity athlete, you also have the beginnings of collegiate celebrities like Red Grange and Notre Dame. Notre Dame becomes a celebrity program. And maybe not for the right reasons. Other people didn't want to play them because they were a Catholic school. So they were forced to basically go out of the Midwest and play schools on the East Coast or the West Coast. And when you have immigrants in places like Boston or New York or California, especially if they're Catholic, they're attracted to Notre Dame. So Notre Dame becomes a nationally popular program. And today we might look at Notre Dame and say, well, they haven't been as good as they were years ago, but they're still on television. They're still out there making money and attracting people. So that's one way, is that as we get into the 20s, as sports becomes more popular and kind of you have that celebrity aspect. And then, of course, the war comes and things kind of slow down. Even though FDR thought it was important for people to play sports, there just weren't a lot of men of college age. And so after the war, we, like with OSU winning their first national championship in football, right? You see these programs that these guys come back and they're veterans and they're going to OU. I mean, that's why OU is so dominant in the early 50s too, because you have these guys returning who are older and stronger and, can put up with the rigors of certain sports. And so in the post-World War II period, as we become more inclusive, more and more people are going to college. They're identifying with colleges that even they don't attend, and then it's the advent of television. That's really going to help in the 60s. So technology, cultural changes like social sort of ebb and flow with immigration and how we become more racially tolerant and things like that add to the people who are not only going to college but supporting college sports.
I never knew that about OU football using veterans with slightly older players then in the late 40s.
In the 40s, a lot of teams were doing that. So it's, OSU was one example. That's when they recently said that they won their national title.
I've seen that sign at Boone Pickens Stadium, yeah.
Right. Other schools were benefiting too. I mean, the Navy and Army really dominated during World War II because they had their handpick of athletes. They could just pick guys to go play on it for either team. So when the other combat veterans come back, they might be 23 or 24, but in the 40s they can play. And so by the time you get into the 50s, it's just it's really starting to change, and it's being more inclusive society.
Huh. It seems like it's grown so fast and become so, college football in particular has become so popular in the South. Is that what are the kind of the cultural factors that led to that, do you think?
Well, people talk about that as a reaction to the Civil War.
Oh.
That coming out of like the Gilded Age progressive era, it was a chance for Southerners to beat Northerners.
Oh.
And so, again, football had started in the Northeast with schools like Rutgers, Princeton. They played the first football game, college football game. And now these other schools down south start to have a chance to go up against them. And so it's great for them to kind of create something, especially in the South, that can draw people together, kind of bond them and bind them too. But the problem for the Northern teams are issues of Jim Crow and race, because if Harvard's going to play Maryland, they don't want to leave their best players home just simply because they're black. So by the 30s, some of the Northern teams are refusing to play the Southern teams because they don't want to leave their players home. And there's, again, after World War II, that starts to open up. And so like in 1948, the Cotton Bowl is integrated when Penn State brings two of their black players to play against SMU.
Huh.
I mean, schools, think about it. Do you want to leave somebody behind that's an important part of your team? So some schools in the North were refusing to play schools in the South, but it did give those Southern teams a chance to go up against the North. And some people see that as like a post-Civil War kind of cultural development. And as we get into the 30s, the bowl games are mostly in the South. And so that allows Southerners to kind of have football dominant in a city, whether it's the Sugar Bowl, the Cotton Bowl, the Orange Bowl. I mean, think of all those where they're located, right? The states, the connection to the agriculture. And they're typically playing Northern schools. So there is that kind of cultural competition that goes on. And then the Southern schools, of course, become just as good, at playing football, or maybe even better. And we do see the same thing happen with basketball after, I don't want to just talk about football, but after World War II, basketball becomes really popular. And two of the most popular programs are Kentucky and Oklahoma A&M. So, again, it's kind of they may not be specifically deep South, but they're certainly not in the North, kind of nationally. And a lot of the schools in New York, the smaller schools, are popular. So a lot of, again, so there are these periods in U.S. history, and you can look at them like the Civil War, the 1920s, the Great Depression, World War II, which create more opportunities not only for people to attend colleges, but make sports more accessible even for the spectators.
Huh. I never thought about the agricultural roots of the names of our bowl games before. That's really fascinating in the South.
Right. If you think about where they're located, Texas, Louisiana, Florida. Now, I'm sure not anymore with the Tostito Bowl.
Right.
But those old original ones.
Right. The Pool and Weed Eater Bowl. You mentioned, you kind of referred to this earlier just briefly, but so many college sports programs now have legions of fans who don't necessarily have strict ties to the college itself. There's a great book called Rammer Jammer Yellow Hammer about Alabama football fans. It's by Warren St. John. Kind of touches on this phenomenon. What are your observations about that? Why do people identify with college sports programs, people who may not have attended the college or have any family member who attended the college? What's that about?
I think that you're right. It's it kind of seems like a strange thing for people to get into if they've never set foot on the campus. But I would say originally it might be like a regionalism thing, like people from Alabama want to back the University of Alabama because it's a rivalry with Georgia or LSU or something like that. So there's that sense of rivalry. And it's just like, even though we may not live in a city, like we could be New York Yankee fans, but we don't live right in New York City, we do have that connection to that regional. So I think for many fans, it's regional. Once you get into television, it's that celebrity aspect too that adds to it. So you think about like Joe Namath when he was at Alabama. these like high profile names that people don't forget about. And Red Grange in the 20s, even before, people were just watching him on film when they would go to movies. So you kind of get drawn towards personalities. And then it could be coaches. And you used Alabama as an example and Bear Bryant. I mean, coaches, a certain personality, when they're dominant, they can draw fans to them and to the program. And so, you don't have to be a college graduate of that. You don't even have to maybe have, like you said, family members who attend that school. But it's something that kind of draws us in. And I think regionally that's an obvious thing, but also the personalities associated with those teams, coaches, players.
Yeah, there's a great section in that book where he kind of quizzes these Alabama fans who spend thousands of dollars following the team, taking their RVs to road games, and he asks them. This author kind of gets in with them and hangs out with them for a year, and he finds out hardly any of these people went to Alabama and even know anybody who goes to the University of Alabama, and he asks them, what explains your love for this team, and a lot of the fans say, our attraction to this team is more pure than just like a college student who goes to Alabama. Of course, they have to be a fan of Alabama. We have like this deep, pure love for this program, even though, of course, I didn't pay tuition for Alabama, but I love it on a deeper level even. It's a great part of that book.
And I think you made a good point when you talked about like the RVs and how these people do this for decades, where college students might do it for 4 years. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. It becomes a part of their social life, and they go every year and they take their RVs and they have their, it's kind of like the pomp and circumstance that surrounds it, right? You go out and you're having your tailgate and you're having fun. And so there's that aspect too. I mean, I'm sure you've been to tailgates and you see what happens and how people are drawn together and the colors, and it brings us connected to the university, even though, hey, we didn't take classes.
Yeah.
We didn't have to take classes.
It's kind of a tribal aspect. Like I belong to this thing that's larger than myself, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's a good point to bring out the kind of social part of it too, that attracts and attaches people.
You briefly mentioned the NCAA earlier.
Right.
Actually, what NCAA, National Collegiate Athletic Association? Is that the correct?
Right. Yes.
What a fascinating organization. How did the NCAA come about, and how has it become so powerful?
Well, let me tell you, you're probably one of the few people who describe it as fascinating. I think most people would describe
horrible
it in negative terms.
Yeah.
Most Americans who follow college sports, and I think people who work in athletic departments, find it frustrating.
Yeah.
Because the NCAA has changed over time. It started out of concern in 1905 for well-being, when there were young men who were dying in football games. This was you look at 1905, you have 18 deaths. It's a situation where people are worried about kind of violence, and so they get university presidents together, and eventually by 1906 they come up with the name NCAA, and they start to talk about what they're going to do, but they really don't deal with some of the social issues that we think they're going to deal with. Over the years, there's a lot of emphasis on amateurism. We talked about that, about maintaining amateurism, making sure students aren't receiving funding from alumni, not only to be recruited, but once they get there. There's a lot of emphasis on GPA. That's why until the mid-60s, there are some sports that you can only play if you're a sophomore or older. Yeah. They don't allow freshmen because they're worried about their grades. They're worried about the effect on it, and maybe even physically, to have an 18-year-old versus maybe a 19 or 20-year-old playing a sport. So they do govern the eligibility requirements even today. And it's not only once you're in school, it's getting into school. So you have to take core courses in high school. You have to have those going in. You have to have a certain GPA. There's all of these things that they have kind of stipulated, and that has changed over the years. In the 20s, they were very much concerned with amateurism and this idea that students were being paid to participate. They were concerned about GPAs, and after the war, things get shaken up. But by 1948, they try to really sanitize it and put in more kind of rigor, eligibility rules. You also what also happens is, you talked about how they become so powerful. The NCAA realizes that if they are corrupt, people won't want to watch them, won't want to support them, right? They'll think college sports is really just these ringers, right? These professionals or these really good players. I mean, we used to have situations where a player would just follow a coach around, and he could play for 10 years. You know, you'd have a 32-year-old quarterback, and it wasn't because he played in Major League Baseball for 8 years before that. It's just that they could just move around, so they cracked down on transferring. And we've seen how that has worked out, not necessarily positive over the years. Students can't transfer. Coaches can hop around from school to school, but only recently are they allowing more flexibility for student athletes to transfer. So they do gain power by basically taking control of it. And what helps them is that starting in the early 50s, there are scandals. And we talk about the death knell, the death penalty, right? People will talk about SMU in the 80s, but really the most of those came about in the 50s. SMU is the latest. And so they're like Kentucky. They can't play basketball for a year because of point shaving. Schools even like Navy and Army get into trouble.
Really?
So they go after everybody. Long Island University, and you might be thinking, well, you know, what's that? They had a really good basketball program. In fact, in the 30s, many of their players were set to go to the 1936 Olympics, but the student athletes voted against it because they didn't want to participate in the so-called Nazi Olympics. But they were a very good team. And in the 50s, they get into trouble for point shaving. So for 6 years, they just closed down their athletic department. So when there are real problems for the NCAA that they can point out and say, we need to fix these, it helps them to gain more power. And then television and television rights. And they start to gain more and more money as football and basketball becomes more and more popular. Think about March Madness. That's been going on for a long time. They've been making a lot of money. And if you want to advertise, if you want to cover them, if you're in the media, you have to pay. So they can, you're right, they can bring in a lot of money. Now, there have been some challenges. OU and Georgia challenged them back in the early 80s because they recognized that the NCAA was a monopoly. They were controlling all the money. So that's why if you look at March Madness, the money that is kind of, you know, that they raise, so to speak, through ticket sales and otherwise, does go towards the conferences that are represented, and then they can dole it out. So they have become very powerful. They've taken that power. It has ebbed and flowed. I think one of the people who really helped them was Miles Brand, who became president in 2002. He was the first university president to take over the NCAA. Up to that point, it had been mostly athletic directors and people in athletics. And I don't know, are you familiar with Miles Brand? Does that name sound familiar?
Was he from Indiana?
Yeah, he was the president who fired
Bobby
Coach
Knight.
Knight.
Yeah.
So you see why they wanted him, right?
Yeah, a pretty gutsy guy.
Yeah, this guy's tough. And so he implemented a lot more of the eligibility rules and graduation rates and things like that. And so they do change over time. And if you go on their website, they tell even high school students, you got to be sure that you're doing everything you need to do because stuff does change. And that's why the Division I schools like TU and OU and OSU, they have people who follow those rules to make sure that their student athletes aren't going to violate any of them, to make sure they have the right credit hours and things like that. So the NCAA has taken that power, but to some degree, college sports had gone out of control, and they were able to step in.
And they operate as a nonprofit, don't they?
Oh, yes. Isn't that funny? They are able to do that. They do, because they are giving some of the money back. It's kind of like they're not a clearinghouse, but they are sort of passing it along to the conferences. And if you think about the conferences who show up in March Madness, we'll use that as an example. Big 12 might have several, ACC might have several, but some of those smaller ones, they might have one team. So that's a lot of money for their conference. Whereas, Big 12 and ACC, they might be doing better just by showing up and selling T-shirts or something like that, or gaining students in popularity. But for some of the smaller conferences, it can really help their schools.
How widespread is corruption in college sports now, do you think? Do we just hear about high-profile cases, or do you think it's pretty deeply baked into the system of college sports? Or
Well, I like to look at the glasses being half full. So I would say that we do hear about the worst case scenarios. I mean, you think about it. If college students are doing something illegal, immoral, we generally don't hear about it. But if they're student athletes, we do. If there's something going on, like if a fraternity, I'm just using that as an example, a fraternity is involved in a racist issue, or if they're involved in something to do with sexual assault, the university takes care of it. They deal with the students. They might be suspended. They might be kicked off campus. There might be criminal action. But if it happens with a football program like Baylor, right, recently, it's all over the news. So athletics, they do attract a lot more attention when there is corruption uncovered. There's also, I think, to some degree, there's stereotyping, so people expect it. There's a lot of anti-athletic kind of sentiment, and there's this expectation that athletes don't go to class and athletes don't study. Well, it may be true of some students, but when you're talking about equestrians, softball players, wrestlers, the players who don't have kind of professionalism as an opportunity down the line, and they're really looking, cross country they've got to graduate because they got to do something with their life. Those student athletes are going to school, and so the corruption, of course, I think, like you said, we hear about it a lot. It does exist, and there have been some really ugly cases. But we could go back to the 50s and see that also. In some ways, it's changed, I think, culturally, when schools, programs, when they are involved in things, the schools kind of self-punish themselves. And they will say, like, we're not going to the postseason because you were passing around inappropriate pictures of other students or something. Social media now is a big problem for student athletes as well as universities. Athletic departments trying to control what's disseminated. So it changes over time. It's not necessarily going to be having someone else take a test. It could be something to do with social media at this point.
Do you mind giving your opinion or maybe summarizing the arguments for and against paying college athletes? That's a pretty sticky situation, I know. I've read great arguments for and against. I don't even know what I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a college professor, so I did play a little bit of college volleyball.
Oh.
Was Division III, but I did have a sense of it's important to study and go to class and get your degree. But I also know it's a lot of hard work for student athletes. So what I would say about the kind of the professional thing is that I think that there are ways to help student athletes as far as making sure they're getting enough to eat. There was that craziness down at OU when the football players went back for seconds at a banquet and they had to report that they had extra pasta. I mean, that's just crazy. I mean, they shouldn't have to do that. So they have changed the rules about allowing students to be able to eat more, because at the large schools like OSU, they may have access to some food, but at the smaller schools, those students might be eating, McDonald's when they're traveling. They're not sitting down to steak dinners like the big schools. So there is that aspect of how do you balance things out? How do you make sure all their needs are met? They do get to have books that they use while they're in school. Well, what about health care? Are they really they're getting health care? What about travel? If they have to go home to visit a parent or a grandparent who's ill, usually they don't receive that kind of stuff. So maybe there are things that you can do without cutting them a paycheck to help them, because they are putting in a lot of extra hours and it doesn't allow them to have part-time jobs like other students. So how do they pay for their cell phone bill? I mean, today to say, students then give up your cell phones, that's crazy. They live on them. They need them, for things. They're looking up stuff for classes. So how do they do that if they can't go out and get a part-time job? There's going to be ways to sort of help them or give them stipends without saying, we're just going to cut you a check. that's kind of, I guess I'm on the fence about it, but I look at it from, let's try to keep them in school and meet their needs, but still maintain this idea that they are students. See what we can do.
It does seem weird too on the highest profile level, like the fact that like Johnny Manziel couldn't sign an autograph and get $5 for it, but Texas A&M could sell his jersey with his name on it, or UCLA can with the Ed O'Bannon case where they used Ed O'Bannon's a video game used Ed O'Bannon's image, and he got no money for that. It's just, I know that's a rare and elite level, but it just does seem weird when so much money is being generated.
And that's a good point to make, because it could be that once the student leaves school, they should be able to get royalties then, right? If Texas A&M, I don't know how that works, but if they're still selling Johnny Manziel's shirt, or they're using someone in a video game, say UCLA is, don't you think now that person should be?
Right.
I mean, because the person, they're no longer there.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's just, take that money and put it into a general fund and then help all the athletes, because Johnny Manziel may sell 10,000 shirts, but someone playing lacrosse isn't.
Yeah.
So, maybe you could benefit all of the student athletes. And again, people also talk about the idea that football does generate the most money. It does carry many of the programs. So how do you juggle sort of keeping football equal to everybody else? It becomes more difficult, say with women's soccer or something like that.
Well, let's talk about how race and gender equality in sports have affected college sports. It seems like maybe we're more familiar with the integration of pro sports, like maybe through the story of Jackie Robinson, but how did the racial integration of college sports progress?
College sports were always integrated. Again, this is a regionalist kind of question.
Okay.
So, Harvard, Yale, University of Nebraska, I mentioned Penn State, schools like that, even in the late 1800s, were fielding or putting on the court black athletes. But again, they got into that problem when they went down south. And a school like Alabama says you can't have your black player on the field with our white players because it's a violation, local ordinance or something like that. So what does the school do? Now the school has a dilemma. So I mentioned like schools like Harvard just said, hey, we're not going to play you guys anymore. So what happens then is schools in the South, and I'm using the South very broadly, begin to desegregate after Brown. And OU, I mean, Prentice Scott, that's a classic story. I don't know why they make it into a movie. You have this young man.
You're talking about after the Brown versus Board of Education.
Right, after Brown, right. So he goes to OU, and he's able to get a scholarship because there's this kind of community support, black doctors, black accountants, people who have money, who are putting money up for a scholarship. And then Bud Wilkinson can offer him a scholarship. And so you have the first school in the South to desegregate, and again, I'm using South broadly, but it's OU. And there's kind of like a domino effect. And of course, when you talk to those players, what it was like, it was very isolated. They had to live in separate dorms. They had to deal with racist attitudes. Guys like Chester Pittman, when he integrated OSU, he had to stay in different hotels when they traveled. You might not be able to eat in the same restaurant, things like that. I mean, that's something we can't imagine today. But in the 50s and even into the early 60s, that could be happening to athletes, even though they were on campus and things like that. So it's really the Southern schools that need to integrate, and OU really breaks down that barrier in beginning with Prentice Scott. And I think that's just like a domino effect. And really, again, you mentioned Alabama. They go until the 70s, and Bear Bryant, he actually kind of puts together a situation where he has Stanford come to Alabama, and Alabama gets beat. And he just says, because you know why? The best players, right? You got to get your best players out there, and sometimes they're black. And if I can only have these white players, and I can't get black players who are just as good or better, so it's a practical thing. You have to have the best football players. And what was happening in the 50s and the 60s, the best black players were leaving Texas or leaving, Alabama or Louisiana because they wanted to play football and they could go play in Michigan or Nebraska or something like that. So the Southern schools have to realize if we're going to compete, we have to start thinking about integration. So it's really more of, again, it's a Southern thing. It's the Southern schools, regional, getting back to that regionalism. And it's and once they do, I mean, then they have great programs again because they're being inclusive. And now, and also what was happening though, there's always, like you talked about, a push-pull, is that the historically black colleges, we haven't talked about them, but they had football programs, basketball programs, sports for men and women that were just, as popular in those communities. And what happens is, as more and more Southern schools integrate, then we start to see those historically black schools, their programs begin to decline because those best athletes are leaving Morehouse and things like that.
Well, speaking of inclusion, if we can talk about gender equality for a minute, what should we know about Title IX? How did it come about? And I'm really curious, what were the objections to it then and maybe still now?
Well, just like with the historically black colleges and universities, women started playing collegiate sports back in the Gilded Age, the late 1800s. And they were playing basketball, and then volleyball becomes popular. And so women were participating, but the rules were different, especially in basketball. They could play like half a court, and you couldn't, you had to be careful how you shot the ball or where you stood and things like that. So the rules and regulations were different.
There were no steals in basketball. It wasn't feminine to steal the ball.
That's not ladylike. You can't steal. But there's this sense that there's these gender ideas about sports, but women are competing, and what happens with Title IX is it's really just part of the 1973 Education Act, and most people apply it to sports, but it covers lots of things at universities and high schools. It covers things like majors. It prevents women from being denied a major in architecture or engineering, which would traditionally been male. It makes sure that women can have organizations, equal access to scholarship money, that they're protected from sexual harassment. But when people hear Title IX, they do identify with sports because they think of it as a way to kind of balance how many teams you have. And that's not really what it's about. It's about opportunities, giving women opportunities. Now, some schools, like if you go online, you can look at them and you'll see they have 7 sports for men and 7 sports for women. And they're, that's how they cover it. Not all schools can do that. So what they might do is provide sports that they think are popular. So they may not have a women's volleyball team, but they'll have a women's soccer team. They try to sort of fit the needs of what the students may be interested in. And that gets complicated. I mean, think about what are some of the criticisms that you've heard of Title IX? Boys sports.
It's taking opportunities away from boys and men who are coaches too, right?
Right. Let's get rid of the wrestling team so we can have a women's soccer team. And that's not what happens. Some programs have to decide what is making money, what is popular. And if you only have a team that hasn't been doing well and you don't have a lot of interest in it, they might cut it. But it's not to replace it with a women's sport. And that's, unfortunately, Title IX does get a bad rap, but it's given so many women opportunities. However, you mentioned something about what about coaches? Well, that's where Title IX kind of reversed course, because before Title IX, most women's sports had women as coaches. Oh. Who's right now the winningest women's basketball coach in America?
Gino at UConn, right?
That's right. It's a man. So women started to lose their jobs because there were men who said, "Hey, this is a pretty good gig," or there were men who said, "I can't get a job coaching men's basketball." Whatever the reason was, is that we have seen more men go coaching women's sports. So it's not necessarily that women in all parts of the athletic department, for instance, have benefit. There are very few female athletic department chairs. There are very few people who hold high-ranking jobs in athletic departments, so that are women, right? So it didn't necessarily translate opportunities above kind of participating in sports.
Well, the disparity between coaches is definitely made up for by the large number of women who coach men's programs now, right? I mean, that's...
I know, isn't that horrible? Those women, they're just taking all those jobs away from those football coaches.
Well, so overall, how do you evaluate kind of the successes and failures of Title IX? Has it been overall a good thing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, personally, for me, I mean, just especially women of my generation, you think back to, generations where women were using really, their uniforms were 10, 15 years old. They couldn't get practice time. Now universities try to sort of balance out practice times between men and women on the courts. It's not perfect. I mean, we talked about UConn. UConn women play basketball on campus. The men play in the Civic Center in Hartford. Who would you rather go see?
Yeah.
But so it's not necessarily always balanced, but there is an effort to try to provide the things they need. You don't have to spend equal amounts of money. Now, obviously, football, the equipment that's needed, the personnel, because you might have 80 players on a football team, that's going to cost a lot more money. And so you're not going to spend the same amount of money on men's football that you would for women's soccer, but you also wouldn't do it for men's lacrosse. It kind of depends on the sport and what they need.
Oh, I see.
There are some restrictions that the federal courts have put on that you have to allow the same practice schedules, allow them to be competitive, allow them to have opportunity to travel, to kind of have support. But again, the sort of when you get down to the dollars, it may not be equal.
Okay. Well, how about the differences between, let's say, women's sports and the less popular men's sports versus the giant revenue-generating sports of football and basketball? When we talked a little bit before the episode, you mentioned something really interesting about how rank is important in college athletic departments. What did you mean by that?
Well, again, football brings in the most money, maybe except at Duke. But most programs, football is bringing in a lot of money, and they need a lot of scholarships. So they can. Football coaches tend to have a little bit more, a lot more flexibility and in recruiting and equipment and things that they can get for their team. And then it kind of doles out. I mean, they're trying to support other teams, but men's basketball is very popular. But going to March Madness might actually cost a school money. So do they really want to turn down an invitation to March Madness? No, but it might cost them some money to bring all of those players, to get everything, to stay there. I mean, think about how long March Madness can go on and getting people rooms and things like that. And there's also the difference between where they might stay or how they might travel. Like we know baseball teams, it's not uncommon for them to ride around on buses because that's sort of their life. That's how they transport them. They're not going to put them on planes the way they might basketball or football teams, or some of the women's teams. So there definitely is a rank as to how much money you're bringing in, but also how much exposure that you get. And it's not no athletic director is going to tell you that one sport is more important than the other. But when you look around, it's sort of realistic that some sports, because of the money they bring in and their popularity, may have a little bit more power or maybe be able to get a little bit better things than others. Everybody wants to be equal, but when it really comes down to it, you might see a little bit. And going back to, again, UConn, women playing, on campus, men up in the Civic Center. So
there's a statue at Princeton University, gargoyles actually at Princeton, that one of them is wearing an academic robe and a mortarboard, and he's kind of in a wrestling death match with another gargoyle that's wearing a football uniform. It's a great picture. I'm going to put it on the website for this episode. And it might be a good illustration of maybe the relationship between big-time college sports programs and the actual colleges that they're connected to. I really am curious your thoughts about, are college sports healthy or unhealthy for like the larger mission and the values of universities?
I think they're healthy. Not everyone obviously would agree. The University of Chicago got rid of their football program. Some schools are like, we're not going to do this because this is either too expensive or it's not worth it. It's too violent. So I think every school has to kind of decide for themselves what they're going to focus on. And I think I look at it from a social perspective. How does it add to campus life? How does it bring students together? And then the student athletes themselves. Many student athletes wouldn't be in college without those scholarships. Trying to get just straight financial aid may not be enough to cover it. And there's also the aspect of maybe I can go to the Olympics, maybe I can compete at a higher level professionally, even for women in basketball, softball, even track and field. Maybe I can get an endorsement, get Nike or somebody to support me. So there's a sense that down the line, they may be able to do something with that particular skill. And there's also other jobs in sports that doesn't have to be, have to compete, so to speak. And I'll just give you an example. I had a student at the University of Tulsa who was a walk-on in football years ago. And he told me he did it because he hoped to go into sports management and be a sports agent. And he played, in one game, senior year, last game, but it was a point that he could be around a football team, be on a football team, and he had that experience. So later on, if he wanted to relate. So I think that depending on your major, depending on your social kind of experience, your economic experience, I think that sports are worth keeping, but it's like anything else. It's, you have to keep working on it.
Last year in Oklahoma, when there were teacher walkouts, we talked a lot about education funding in Oklahoma. I talked to a college professor who said he thought that Lincoln Riley's salary was more than the entire operating budget of his college. And, T. Boone Pickens' giant donations to the sports program at OSU are really impressive. But how do you feel about the divide between how we fund education versus the large amounts of money that sports can generate, but also that they cost?
Yeah, and T. Boone Pickens would say, "Hey, it's my money.
Yeah,
I'll do
sure.
what I want with it."
Right.
And the robber barons 100 years ago, back with Rockefeller and Carnegie, they believed in the gospel of wealth and giving away money, but they were going to give it to whom they wanted to give it to. And so you can't tell somebody like, Mr. Pickens, we really think you should fund the history department.
Right.
That's not gonna fly. Believe me, we tried, but it didn't happen. So first you have to take that into consideration. Some people would argue it trickles down. It might be able to help create better facilities for certain things. Certainly, after March Madness, many schools, they find the applications increase because people want to go there because they've seen them. They got into the Final Four or something like that. But the discrepancy is amazing sometimes when you look at how much money is going in. Now, someone like Lincoln Riley, any college coach, much of their salary is actually coming from people who are donating money. And they also get money from doing what we're doing, talking, they interviews, they have those radio shows once a week. So money is coming from outside of the state budget. And I know a lot of times people become angry because they'll look at someone and they'll say, gee, they're making so much money. But when you break down their salary, that money is not necessarily coming from taxpayers. It's coming from, when it gets crazy is when you have these coaches who leave and they keep firing coaches and they're paying like 2 or 3 coaches. And then you're like, wait a minute, where is that money coming from? But I think you're right. I mean, it's such a discrepancy between schools, too, as to whom has more money than the others and how that money is spent, how it's invested, whether it goes into facilities, does it go back into academics? Are they, how are they using it? And unfortunately, a lot of times it's the person who gives the money gets to decide. Like even Rockefeller was given money, this idea of giving money to sports or giving money to the arts or things like that. You can't really tell someone what they're going to do with their money, unfortunately, although we'd like to.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking so much about college sports. In the few minutes we have left, I really wanted to ask you, just in a general sense, What are valuable aspects of sports for our culture, for our society? Like, I mean, why do people love sports so much? Why do we watch sports?
Well, I think it's sort of they're entertaining, right? And of course, it feels good. I mean, people, they feel really good when your team wins the Super Bowl or a national championship, and you feel really bad when they don't. But
the
there's
vast
this
majority
sense
of the time.
yeah, and it's unfortunate because they've done studies, and when people lose, the Stanley Cup or something like that, domestic violence does increase. There's an interesting relationship we haven't really talked about between violence and sports. And when sociologists and psychologists and historians started really studying sports in the 70s, they started talking about the idea that we tolerate certain things as a culture. And so how much do we tolerate as far as how people are being treated, whether it's violence, racism, sexism? And I think a lot of times we can see that best in sports. I know one of the reasons I started teaching sports and I enjoyed it because it was a way to get students to think about things like racism, sexism, gender, sexual orientation, because a lot of times they'll just tune that out. But when it's something, when it affects your favorite football team or or your college, you might think about it differently. If your favorite athlete suddenly announces that he's gay, how are you going to deal with that? Are you still going to support him? What about if someone suddenly is involved in a domestic violence situation? How do you respond to that? How do you think your team or your university? So I think that we can use sports as a way to deal with some of these social issues, cultural issues, but keep moving forward. And again, you have to remember that they are fun and they are entertaining, but there's a lot at stake if there's students who are trying to graduate using sports or students who are trying to become professional, or maybe they already are professional. It can become personal for them.
So do you study sports on a completely clinical, studious level, or are you a sports fan yourself?
No, I am. I'm a sports fan. I've been a sports fan since I was a kid. I've been a Patriots fan from New England. And I was a Red Sox fan, but then I married my husband, and he's a Yankees fan. So I had to kind of tone that down in order for marital, having some marital happiness. But I do. I mean, I look at stuff all the time, and I follow it, and sometimes, I'm sure I'm a little bit too sensitive, but I do respond to things when I think of them in cultural and social terms. But yeah, being a Patriots fan has been really easy the past 19 years.
Yeah, congratulations.
Prior to that, when I was a kid, it wasn't. I still haven't got over their loss to the Chicago Bears back in the Super Bowl. Score was 54-28.
Yeah.
It was a lot worse than that. So I am, I do follow sports. I when I taught at TU, when I taught at OSU, I followed those teams. Because it is fun, but I realized again, that there are ways that you can teach people things, and maybe sometimes the cultural stuff becomes too much, and people will just say, "Well, it's just football." It is, but again, you get back to the personal. For that person, it's a little bit more, and we have to think about that. And again, with social media, people can get really angry and opinionated, and it's not just about somebody fumbling or missing a foul shot. Sometimes it can go over a line. So I think that sports can help us understand more cultural and social things. But yeah, it can be fun.
Are there any athletes?
It's fun to win 6 Super Bowls.
Oh yeah. I'll take your word for that because I'm a Miami Dolphins fan. So it's been a long time.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I don't mean to upset you. I'm sorry.
Are there? Speaking of lessons you can learn from sports, are there particular athletes that you've really enjoyed following or reading about their lives I love reading about Muhammad Ali, and I love reading about the culture that he lived in at the time and why he did the things he did. Are there any athletes that stick out to you that?
Well, Ali. I mean, I loved Ali as a kid, and I used to watch, listen to his music. He had some stuff he did with cartoons and stuff for kids, and I just thought he was fabulous. And it wasn't until I, got older and I started studying him, and I realized all the things he did, culturally, and what he represented to a generation. He had influence on the origins of rap and hip hop. I mean, culturally speaking, and also for religion. and standing up for your religious rights and things like that. And so Ali was like historical figures, Ali and Billie Jean King. Again, that's my generation. I watched her play, and what she did for women and sort of speaking out and speaking up for women. And something that people don't realize is she really wanted to integrate sports on a gender plane, that men and women would compete, not necessarily just against each other, but with each other. And that was something she really hoped to do. And that did happen for a little while in tennis. She was able to do that. So Billie Jean King and Muhammad Ali, like you, are my historical figures. I really like Serena Williams. Don't really follow tennis, but I follow her. And again, for what she's done, she's had to deal with a lot with people attacking her for her body image. The fact that she hits too hard, or she grunts, or she has a meltdown, and you think of John McEnroe and you're like, yeah, what's the big deal, right? I mean, she's no different, but it brings in race and gender issues. And so I really like the way she's stood up for herself and what she's represented as a woman. Now she's become a mother, and she's fantastic. She's unbelievable as a person, but also as an athlete. And then more local, I really like Matt Slater, who plays for the Patriots. He's a special teams guy. Nobody's really heard of him except he shows up on the Pro Bowl. But he represents someone who does the right thing. He's a good person. He plays special teams, wide receiver. He does whatever you like. So I think it's important to have those real famous people like Ali and Billie Jean and Serena, but also people like him who do what needs to be done. Are looked up to by their teammates, are great leaders, respected by other people within the organization of the NFL. I mean, I think that's important too, that we need those type of people.
Thanks so much for mentioning that. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Carreiro. This is great. I really appreciate being able to talk about sports with you.
This has been fun. I'm really happy that you gave me this opportunity. And I'd like to thank the Humanities Council. I had a great time when I was their scholar in residence. It was really nice to travel around Oklahoma and go to the different museums and historical societies and things like that. So I did appreciate that. And I lived in Oklahoma for 25 years. And for a kid coming out of Rhode Island, of course, it was a little culture shock. But I would have never been exposed to big-time college sports like OU and OSU had I not done that. And get a chance to really root for those teams, and having student athletes and non-student athletes who were just great, and I wish them all the luck, and I just had a really good time teaching there. When I left in a good mood. I left saying I had a good time. It wasn't out of that I was frustrated, and so I do think that that's a great state.
Well, great. Thank you again. We really appreciate you coming on the Brain Box. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the Brain Box podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/brainbox website, and on social media by using #BrainboxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Lauren Nixon, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities or our underwriters. This has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin.